Uh,
I'm also
Speaking of
big on
science,
having
oh, go
simulators.
ahead.
I'm also really like I'm a big proponent of having a simulator mode in like in main tranquility, so that way you no longer needed singularity. That the idea of doing these kinds of simulations is just something you can do. Like you could do your tutorials that way. You could practice with somebody else in like you can help teach somebody in scenarios. You could do tournaments safer because you could do them within the simulation.
Yeah,
You could
the
teach very
accessibility
specific
factor,
concepts.
the
Yeah,
accessibility factor of singularity is off the charts, basically.
right. Well, so one of the other things I'd really like to see in that case is so you could have scenarios that teach lessons, but you can also make them thematically interesting. Like you could play through BTAC-R. You could relive BTAC-R with none of the tie dye because all of the actors are they know exactly, they have a recording of what everybody did and when they died, so you could play out a recording of BTAC-R that you get to quote unquote participate
You've
in.
talked about this
Yeah,
before.
I
I
have.
think this is a very interesting. It's a very interesting idea. Like using it as a museum.
Right. Well, and Valkyrie does this theoretically.
Like, it would be really cool to have a museum server, honestly.
But I'm just saying, like, if you're going the way, like, if you get past the idea that singularity is quote unquote bad for the game because it lets people avoid risk, and you accept the fact that people being able to do risk things that avoid risk but receive no reward, then there's at the next step is you should just integrate a simulator into Eve Online itself. And like I said, the biggest gain from
Right.
that is the idea that you could make the tutorial into a series of very specific challenges that you could choose when to take on.
So it's funny because they don't really need to build a simulator into Eve
No,
Online because it's already there. Like
right.
Abyss was the first simulator. They could decide that what happens in Abyss stays in Abyss and like doesn't come out, or they can set what rules do and don't come, to and from those systems when people use filaments or any other method of transporting people around. But the idea of having dedicated solar systems where you drop people in and you create a site just for them, and maybe there's a couple of people in that solar system but they don't know that and they never interact with each other, they're effectively instanced. So that was like, that's as much of a simulator as you ever need. They just need to like strap a few more rules onto it in terms of like the impact on your wallet and your assets and all that stuff, and boom, you've got your simulator. It's already built.
Yeah. I would love to see it where you activate it in like a shuttle and you just appear with the ship that you're supposed to be using, you know?
Hmm.
I also really
Yeah,
like that
like,
idea because
sure.
then you don't get to choose your own ship, right? Like, what if the randomness is
Right.
on is in the ship type, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
you have a caracal today.
There's a couple of different builds. So the Tarkov, Escape from Tarkov uses that system for the scav. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
No.
So, oh, awesome. Then you're a lucky 10,000. Um, Escape from Tarkov, for people who don't know, is a shooter game. It's a hardcore full loot drop PvP shooter, survival shooter, or whatever. And there are two modes that you can play in. Basically, one is your character. Your account has a character. Period. That's what you've got. Um, and you level it up, and you have gear, and what you bring in, just like in Eve, what you bring in is what you bring out. And you have to survive, and if you die out there, then you lose everything, and you come back again with whatever you had in your stash. But what you had on you is gone. The other mode that you can play in is called Scav or Scavenger. And a scav is a free throwaway, randomly generated character with a semi-random loadout. Like it's a procedurally generated loadout on that character, and you can go in with this scav, and it's separate from your main character, and it just has this like crappy gear, sometimes a little bit better, but it's completely random, and it's like see what you can do uh, with this super basic crappy gear, and the only restriction on it is a cooldown timer on how often you can use it. I think it's like once every half hour or something like around there. So that's kind of what you're describing.
Yeah. And again, I think that one of the themes of the last few years is, there are certain assumptions and premises that EVE Online has been based on, and some of them were really good and made EVE successful, and some of them probably held back EVE. In my opinion, I think that what the Abyss taught us was that while it was probably good that that CCP avoided instanced gameplay in the early days, at a certain point that becomes a limiter. This arbitrary you cannot have instances in the game becomes a limiter to how complex and detailed and demanding the PvE can
Yeah,
be.
stuff all that. Stuff all that. Like you can't have instances in my game. Like that's a whole other discussion,
Right.
and like I have an argument about that, but
But
I actually wanted to. Yeah, go
what I'm
ahead.
saying is that this is kind of more of the same. What we're doing is we are going over the core assumptions that have made Eve work, the things that we've always just kind of echoed around to each other and understood to be truisms. The last few years has been about breaking those down and figuring out which one of those things are really truisms.
Warp drive active.
That was it. Sorry.